So I want to make a quick video to talk about how DNS works. So when you first load up your browser and you try to, I don't know, type in, for example, google.com, what exactly is happening under the hood? Because somehow it's hitting some type of server and that server is returning a response to you, right? So for example, if you do google.com, that eventually has to make some type of request to the internet. You get a response back from a server and then your browser displays it. And of course, this is not just for browsers. This is for phones, for other clients, etc. Now, do note, as I'm drawing out, just imagine that there's going to be tons and tons of different servers that could potentially take your request. And there's a different hierarchy of how DNS kind of works. But the first thing that happens is when you type in, I'll just do like, for example, instead of Google, say webdevcody.com. What actually happens? So first of all, your browser is going to try to hit a resolver. So DNS resolver. So in terms of the DNS resolver, its job is to just return an IP address. So like I'll just go ahead and say like 203.0.0, I don't know, just something random, right? Now, typically the DNS resolver is like a remote service. So like your ISP could potentially do this for you, or you could point directly to a Google resolver. I think 8888 is a common one. But basically your computer has to make requests somewhere so that the resolver can figure out where exactly this machine lives. Okay, so after this point, the DNS resolver needs to make a request to the root zone. Now, I don't know if it's worth putting the companies who actually like manage these things. I will put the names ICANN and IANA. So if you ever buy a domain, you may see these things pop up, where basically, if you were to buy a domain like webdevcody.com, somehow the root zone needs to know about it. And that will eventually route to another server that we'll call the top level domain. So we'll make another one here called TLD, top level domain, but there's a different, organization that basically owns all these top level domains. Top level domain is owned by VeriSign, but I mean, if you like .net, it's owned by another company. If you do .org, I'm sure it's owned by a different company. But these root zones know how to point to the TLDs to know how to look up particular things. So when you make a request of webdevcody.com in your browser, that has to go to your DNS resolver. The DNS resolver has to go to the root zone, which I guess the resolvers are kind of just configured to know which machines potentially run the root zones. The root zone is going to look at your domain and say, okay, what's the extension? .com? Okay, I know I need to point to VeriSign's servers. The VeriSign servers are, again, going to say, well, let's look up where webdevcody.com is registered. In our case, I like using Cloudflare, so I would probably register my domain on Cloudflare, but there's also like Namecheap. There's tons of other ones out there. So let's just pretend like you have Cloudflare. So I'll just go ahead and put Cloudflare DNS, right? They own their own set of servers that handle their records, because when I go to cloudflare.com and I buy a domain, I typically have a way to add my own records in, okay? And then eventually, this will be my own server, which we'll kind of talk about. I'll just say like my own server. Okay, I'll draw some arrows over here, and then we'll just draw some arrows back so it makes sense as to how this is kind of all working, right? And the way it works is when you buy a domain on a registrar, the registrar knows how to make a request to whatever subdomain that you're using and tell it, hey, someone just bought a domain. VeriSign is going to trust Cloudflare, and it's going to be like, okay, let's just go ahead and put another record inside of my record set, so that if someone makes a request to webdevcody.com, we know that we need to forward the name server to be handled by Cloudflare. So the one thing I do want to point out here is that typically this top level domain doesn't hold IP addresses. It's just going to hold like NS records. Okay, so it's going to tell us that, hey, when you try to access this domain, you need to actually point to Cloudflare's DNS servers. And we can actually see this. If we type in dig ns and then webdevcody.com, you'll see a bunch of domains pop up that all say cloudflare.com. So when I bought my domain on Cloudflare, it wrote a record to VeriSign's top level domain that knows that when someone requests this, it actually needs to forward the request to Cloudflare, and then Cloudflare is going to know how to figure out exactly what I'm asking. Like, for example, if I do a Far Cry demo.webdevcody.com, somehow it knows to give back this IP address. And the way this is working is because I basically put a record in Cloudflare. You'll see over here, Far Cry demo, it's an A record. It points back this IP address, and I configure that right here manually. Okay, I put this inside of Cloudflare. I didn't put it inside anywhere else, right? Now, another thing to point out is that all this stuff could have caching in between, right? You could have layers of caching so that when people make these requests, it doesn't take a long time to get a response back. And this can cause a lot of problems when you first buy a domain and set it to an IP address, or later on in the future you decide to change the IP address to be something else. what can happen is that these caching layers in between can take some time to basically get the latest information. You can even have caching on your actual laptop itself. So internally, there could be some caching that you have to kind of clear out or flush the DNS on your laptop. So if you ever run into issues where you've updated your records in Cloudflare and like it's just not propagating, it does take some time. And sometimes it can take whatever this 300 is. Like, you know, you're specifying that it should only take a max of 300 seconds, but it could take much longer than that. It could take up to like a day or so. But I've seen that usually if you change a record, it should update within that like 300 seconds or whatever you set, okay? So at a high level, that is basically what's happening when you try to request a domain. And of course, we have different top level domains here. So like .net would be one, we'd have .org could be one, and the root zone would know how to basically make requests to those based on the domain that was registered and what request you're making in. So there's probably more detail that I skipped out. Again, I'm trying to keep these really high level so you can just understand, you know, at a glance, when you make a request to your domain, what exactly is happening, because it kind of seems like black magic, but it's really just a bunch of servers that are caching records and holding records and registering records so that it knows how to point to your actual web server. All right, that is about it. Leave a comment if there's anything else you want me to make a video on in the future, and I'll try to do my best. All right, have a good day and happy coding.